I was stacking the third cord of firewood when I heard the sirens, and my first thought was that someone's house must be on fire. But then I saw the police cruiser pull up right in front of my property on Maple Ridge Drive in Asheville, North Carolina, and realized with sinking dread that someone had actually called the cops on me for receiving a firewood delivery. The officer stepped out of his vehicle, a middle-aged guy with graying hair and the tired expression of someone who had dealt with way too many nonsense calls. I set down the log I was holding and walked toward the driveway, wiping sawdust off my flannel shirt. Behind me, Tony, the delivery driver from Mountain Wood Supply, stopped unloading and shot me a concerned look. "Good morning, officer," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "I'm Harrison Wells. I own this property. Is there a problem?" The officer glanced at his notepad. "We received a 911 call about unauthorized commercial activity taking place at this address. Someone reported multiple delivery trucks and claimed you're running an illegal business out of your home." I felt my jaw tighten. I had a pretty good idea who made that call. "Officer, I run a small firewood business that's completely legal and properly registered with the county. I have all the necessary permits and commercial rights for this property." Before the officer could respond, I heard the click of heels on pavement and knew exactly who was coming. Patricia Morrison, the HOA president and the biggest pain in my neck since I'd moved to this neighborhood 6 months ago, came striding up my driveway like she owned the place. She was in her late 40s, with that distinctive haircut that seemed to be standard issue for women who made complaining their full-time job, blonde highlights and all. "Officer, thank goodness you're here," Patricia said, clutching her designer purse. "This man has been running a commercial operation in a residential neighborhood in direct violation of our HOA covenants. We've had trucks coming and going all week, noise complaints, and he's stockpiling wood like he's preparing for the apocalypse." The officer held up a hand. "Madam, let me handle this. Are you the one who called 911? Patricia straightened her shoulders. "Yes, I am. As HOA president, it's my duty to enforce our community standards and protect property values. Commercial activities are strictly prohibited in Maple Ridge Estates." I pulled my phone from my pocket. "Officer, can I show you something? I have all my documentation right here. When I purchased this property, I specifically ensured it had commercial zoning rights. The previous owner ran a landscaping business from this address for 15 years. The officer nodded. "Let me see what you've got." I pulled up the documents on my phone, but I also had printed copies inside. "Tony, can you hold off on the rest of the delivery for a minute?" Tony nodded, leaning against his truck and clearly enjoying the show. I jogged inside and grabbed the folder I kept specifically for situations like this. Patricia had been harassing me about my business since the first delivery truck showed up, and I'd learned to keep my paperwork handy. When I came back out, Patricia was still talking to the officer. "Our covenants clearly state that no commercial vehicles are allowed to park on the property, and certainly no business operations. This is a family neighborhood." "Mrs. Morrison," the officer said, and I could hear the patience wearing thin in his voice, "I need you to let me do my job here." I handed him the folder. "Here's my business license, my commercial property designation from the county, my LLC registration, and the property deed showing the commercial rights. You'll see everything is in order." The officer flipped through the papers, taking his time. The morning sun was getting warmer, and I could see a few neighbors starting to peek out their windows and doors. This was exactly the kind of spectacle Patricia loved creating, but it was exhausting for everyone else. "This looks legitimate," the officer said after a few minutes. "Mr. Wells, according to these documents, you're legally permitted to operate a small business from this property. The commercial designation predates the HOA covenants. Patricia's face went red. That's impossible. Our covenants supersede any previous arrangements. When he bought this house, he agreed to follow our rules. Actually, madam, that's not how it works, the officer said. If the property had commercial rights before the HOA covenants were established, or if those rights were specifically preserved in the deed, they can't be overridden by HOA rules. That's North Carolina property law. I felt a wave of relief, but I could see Patricia wasn't done. Officer, surely there are limits. He can't just have trucks coming and going whenever he wants, disrupting the peace of our neighborhood. The officer turned to me. What kind of operation are you running here? I sell and deliver firewood, I explained. I get deliveries like this about twice a week during the busy season. Tony here brings me raw logs and split wood. I process what needs processing, I store it, and then I deliver to customers. Most of my business is online orders. I'm not running a retail storefront or anything like that. And you have customers coming to the property? The officer asked. Occasionally, maybe 1 or 2 a week. Most people prefer delivery. The ones who do pick up their own orders usually come in the evening or on weekends. The officer made a few notes. Sounds pretty low impact to me. Mrs. Morrison, 911 is for emergencies. This is a civil matter at best, and from what I can see, there's no violation occurring. You shouldn't have called 911 for this. Patricia's mouth opened and closed like a fish. But the dispatcher took my call. They sent you out here. Yes, madam, because when someone calls 911, we respond. But the dispatcher who took your call actually flagged this as a non-emergency and checked the property records while you were on the line. According to the notes here, you were informed that Mr. Wells has commercial rights to this property, but you insisted on an officer being dispatched anyway. I hadn't known that detail, and it made me appreciate the dispatcher even more. They'd done their homework. That dispatcher was mistaken, Patricia said, her voice getting shrill. I've been president of this HOA for 7 years, and I know our covenants inside and out. Commercial activity is not allowed. The officer closed his notepad with a decisive snap. Madam, I'm going to say this one more time. The commercial rights on this property are legal and valid. If you have a dispute about HOA covenants, that's a civil matter you'll need to take up through proper channels, not emergency services. If you call 911 again for something that isn't an emergency, you could be cited for misuse of emergency services. Patricia looked like she wanted to argue more, but the officer's expression made it clear he was done with this conversation. She turned on her heel and marched back toward her house, which was 3 doors down from mine. I could practically see the steam coming out of her ears. Tony let out a low whistle once she was out of earshot. Man, I've seen some crazy HOA stuff in my years doing deliveries, but that takes the cake. She really called 911 on you. The officer shook his head. Mr. Wells, I apologize for the inconvenience. Your paperwork is all in order. I'll file a report noting that there's no violation here. If she continues to harass you, you may want to consider documenting everything and possibly pursuing a restraining order if it gets bad enough. I appreciate that, officer. Thank you for being reasonable about this. He nodded and headed back to his cruiser. As he drove away, Tony climbed back into his truck. Want me to finish this delivery, or should we wait? Let's finish it. I've got customers counting on this wood. We spent the next hour unloading the rest of the delivery. 3 cords of mixed hardwood, mostly oak and hickory, which would season nicely in my covered storage area. I'd built the storage racks myself when I first moved in, using the existing concrete pad the previous owner had left behind. Everything was neat, organized and tucked behind a privacy fence so it wasn't even visible from the street. After Tony left, I went inside and made myself a strong cup of coffee. My hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline. I'd dealt with Patricia's complaints before, but this was escalating to a ridiculous level. Calling 911 because I was receiving a firewood delivery. It was insane. My phone rang, and I saw it was my business partner and best friend, Henry Wagner. We'd started the firewood business together, though he handled mostly the delivery side while I managed inventory and customer service. "Dude, I just heard from Tony," Henry said as soon as I answered. "Did Patricia really call the cops on you?" 911 actually. Had a police officer and everything. Henry let out a long string of creative profanity. "That woman is unhinged. What did the cops say?" He confirmed everything is legal and told Patricia to stop calling emergency services for non-emergencies. The dispatcher had already checked the property records and told her I have commercial rights, but she demanded they send someone anyway. So she knew she was wrong and called anyway. That's harassment, man. I know. The officer suggested I might need to document everything if it continues. Henry was quiet for a moment. "You know what? I think we should go on the offensive here. Patricia has been making your life hell since you moved in. Maybe it's time to push back." I took a sip of my coffee, considering. I wasn't naturally confrontational, but Henry had a point. Patricia had filed noise complaints, sent me nasty letters about my truck being parked in my own driveway, and now she'd called 911 on me. Where would she draw the line? "What are you thinking?" I asked. "Well, for starters, we should make sure all your documentation is bulletproof. Then maybe we attend the next HOA meeting and address this directly. If she's going to keep coming after you, at least make sure the other neighbors know what's actually going on. I bet most of them don't even care about your business." It was a good idea. I'd been avoiding HOA meetings because they seemed like a waste of time, but maybe it was time to show up and defend myself properly. "The next meeting is on Thursday," I said. "I got a notice in the mail yesterday." "Perfect. I'll come with you for moral support. And maybe you should talk to a lawyer, just to cover your bases." After we hung up, I spent the rest of the day processing orders and trying to calm down. I had 3 deliveries scheduled for the afternoon, all to customers in the surrounding areas. The business was doing well, better than I'd expected when I first started. There was a growing demand for quality firewood in the Asheville area, especially with more people installing wood stoves and fire pits. That evening I called my uncle, Richard Wells, who was a real estate attorney in Charlotte. I explained the situation, and he listened without interrupting. "Harrison, from what you're describing, you're completely in the clear legally," Uncle Richard said when I finished. "The commercial rights on your property are clearly documented and predate the HOA. But that doesn't mean Patricia won't make your life difficult. HOAs can be incredibly petty, and they sometimes use legal fees as a weapon, knowing most people can't afford to fight back. So what do I do? Keep meticulous records of everything. Every interaction with Patricia or the HOA board, every letter, every complaint. If they try to fine you, don't pay without fighting it. And at the next HOA meeting, I'd suggest you present your case clearly and calmly. Most HOA members are reasonable people who just want to live their lives. It's usually 1 or 2 busybodies who cause all the problems." I thanked him and promised to keep him updated. That night, I couldn't sleep well, my mind racing through various scenarios. I'd moved to this neighborhood because the house was perfect for my needs, and the price was right. The commercial zoning was a huge bonus. I'd never imagined the HOA would be this much of a problem. The next morning, I was up early, working on cutting and splitting some of the logs Tony had delivered. I had a commercial-grade log splitter that made the work much easier, though it was still physically demanding. Around 9 in the morning, I heard someone calling my name from the driveway. I shut off the splitter and turned to see my neighbor, Frank Mitchell, walking up. Frank lived 2 houses down on the other side from Patricia, and he'd always been friendly. "Hey, Harrison," Frank said, looking a bit uncomfortable. "I heard about what happened yesterday with Patricia and the police." "News travels fast," I said, wiping sweat from my forehead. "Well, you know how it is in an HOA. Patricia called an emergency board meeting last night. I'm on the board, which is why I wanted to give you a heads up." That got my attention. "An emergency meeting? About me?" Frank nodded. "She's trying to push through a special assessment to fund legal action against you. She wants the HOA to sue you to shut down your business." I felt my stomach drop. "On what grounds? I have commercial rights." "I know, and I told her that. So did Mike Chen, the treasurer. But Patricia is convinced that the HOA covenants override your commercial designation. She's talking about hiring a lawyer and going after you hard." "Did the board vote on it?" "Not yet. We tabled it until the regular meeting on Thursday. I wanted you to know so you're prepared. And honestly, I wanted to apologize. I don't think you're doing anything wrong. Your business is quiet, you keep everything neat, and you've been a good neighbor. Patricia just has it out for you." I thanked Frank for the warning and asked him what he thought would happen at the meeting. He seemed to think that most board members were skeptical of Patricia's crusade, but she was very persuasive and had a lot of influence. Over the next few days, I prepared for the Thursday meeting like I was preparing for trial. I made copies of all my documentation, printed out North Carolina property law summaries that supported my position, and even put together a simple presentation showing how minimal the impact of my business was on the neighborhood. Henry came over Wednesday evening to help me rehearse. "You need to stay calm and factual," he advised. "Don't let Patricia get under your skin. Stick to the facts, show your documents, and appeal to the reasonable people in the room." Thursday evening arrived, and I felt like I was going to throw up. The HOA meetings were held in the community clubhouse, a small building near the neighborhood entrance. When Henry and I arrived, the parking lot was surprisingly full. Apparently, word had gotten around that there was going to be drama. Inside, the clubhouse was set up with rows of folding chairs facing a table where the board members sat. Patricia was in the center, looking smug and confident. Frank gave me an encouraging nod from his seat on the board. I recognized Mike Chen, the treasurer, and Barbara Allen, the secretary. There were 2 other board members I'd seen around but never formally met. Henry and I took seats in the front row. I noticed several neighbors I recognized, including a few who'd been friendly to me. The room was buzzing with conversation. Patricia called the meeting to order at exactly 7 o'clock, banging a gavel that seemed ridiculously dramatic. She went through the standard opening procedures, minutes from the last meeting, treasurer's report, all the usual HOA business. I could tell she was drawing it out, building tension. Finally, she got to what she called new business and ongoing concerns. "As many of you know," Patricia began, her voice taking on a grave tone, "we have a serious situation developing in our community. One of our residents has been operating a commercial business in direct violation of our covenants. This threatens the character of our neighborhood and potentially impacts all of our property values." She was talking about me without saying my name, which seemed cowardly. I raised my hand. "Patricia, if you're talking about me, I'd like the opportunity to address the board and the community." Patricia's lips pressed into a thin line. "There will be time for comments after the board presents its concerns. With all due respect, I think the community deserves to hear both sides of this issue," I said, standing up. "I'm Harrison Wells, for those who don't know me. I live at 847 Maple Ridge Drive, and yes, I operate a small firewood business from my property." Several people turned to look at me. I saw some curious faces, some supportive ones, and a few that looked disapproving. Patricia tried to interrupt, but Mike Chen spoke up. "Actually, Patricia, I think we should hear from Mr. Wells. This directly affects him, and it's only fair." Patricia looked like she'd swallowed a lemon, but she nodded curtly. "Fine. Mr. Wells, you have 5 minutes." I walked to the front of the room, and Henry helped me set up the documents I'd brought. "Thank you. I'll be brief. When I purchased my property 6 months ago, I specifically looked for a home with commercial zoning rights. My property has had these rights since before this HOA was established. The previous owner ran a landscaping business from the same address for 15 years without any issues. I held up my property deed. This is my deed, which clearly shows the commercial designation. I also have my business license, my LLC registration, and confirmation from the county that all my permits are in order. I've brought copies for the board to review." Patricia leaned forward. "The issue isn't whether you have some old commercial designation. The issue is our HOA covenants, which every homeowner agrees to when they purchase property here. Those covenants explicitly prohibit commercial activity." I'd expected this. "I've read the covenants carefully, Mrs. Morrison. What they actually say is that homeowners agree not to conduct business activities that create a nuisance, excessive traffic, or negatively impact the neighborhood. My business doesn't do any of those things. I receive 1 or 2 deliveries per week. I keep all my materials neatly stored behind a privacy fence, and I have minimal customer traffic." "You had a police car at your house on Monday," Patricia shot back. "That sounds like a nuisance to me." I felt anger flare up but kept my voice steady. "The police were there because you called 911 on me for receiving a firewood delivery. The officer confirmed that my business is completely legal and advised you to stop calling emergency services for non-emergencies." There were some murmurs in the crowd. I could see several people looking at Patricia with surprise or disapproval. Barbara Allen, the secretary, spoke up. "Patricia, you called 911. That seems excessive." "I called to report a violation," Patricia said defensively. "It's my responsibility as HOA president to enforce our rules." "But the officer said there was no violation," I pointed out. "In fact, the dispatcher who took your call checked the property records and informed you that I have commercial rights. You demanded an officer be sent anyway." Patricia's face was getting red. "This is beside the point. The point is that we have covenants, and those covenants exist to protect our property values and maintain the character of Maple Ridge Estates." I looked around the room at my neighbors. "I understand the desire to protect property values. That's why I keep my property neat and professional. But I also have the legal right to operate my business. This isn't about me being a bad neighbor. This is about Mrs. Morrison personally disagreeing with how I use my property, even though that use is completely legal." Mike Chen cleared his throat. "Harrison, can you tell us more about the nature of your business? How much activity are we really talking about?" I nodded, grateful for the reasonable question. "Sure. I sell firewood online and through word of mouth. I receive bulk deliveries of logs and split wood about twice a week during the busy season, which is roughly September through March. Those deliveries take maybe an hour. I process and store the wood on my property, which I do during normal daylight hours. I make deliveries to customers myself or sometimes with my business partner, and occasionally, maybe once or twice a week, a customer will pick up an order from my property. That's it. No retail store, no signs advertising my business, no employees coming and going. What about noise? Someone from the audience asked. I use a log splitter, which makes some noise, but I only operate it between 10 in the morning and 5 in the evening on weekdays, never on Sundays. It's no louder than a lawn mower, and I use it less frequently than most people mow their lawns. Frank leaned back in his chair. I live 2 houses down from Harrison, and honestly, I barely notice his business. I've heard the log splitter occasionally, but like he said, it's not any worse than regular yard work. I don't see what the big deal is. Patricia wasn't giving up. The big deal is that we have standards in this community. If we allow one person to run a business, what's to stop everyone from opening shops out of their homes? We could have auto repair businesses, daycare centers, all sorts of commercial activity that would destroy the residential character of our neighborhood. I jumped back in. That's a slippery slope argument that doesn't hold up. First, not every property in this neighborhood has commercial rights like mine does. Second, the county has zoning regulations that prevent exactly the kind of scenarios you're describing. My business is specifically permitted because it's low impact and compatible with residential use. Mike Chen was flipping through the documents I'd provided. Patricia, I have to say, this all looks legitimate. Harrison's property has had commercial designation since 1998, long before our HOA was incorporated in 2007. And according to North Carolina law, those pre-existing rights can't be superseded by HOA covenants. I disagree with that interpretation, Patricia said firmly. And I propose that the HOA hire an attorney to pursue legal action against Mr. Wells to clarify this matter. That would cost thousands of dollars in legal fees, Mike pointed out, money that would come from the dues we all pay. It's worth it to protect our community, Patricia insisted. Barbara Allen shook her head. I don't think we should spend HOA funds on a lawsuit that we'll probably lose. I've done some research since Monday, and everything I've read supports what Harrison is saying. Properties with pre-existing commercial rights retain those rights even after HOA covenants are established, unless the owner specifically waives them. The other 2 board members, whose names I learned were Janet Rodriguez and Tom Brennan, both seemed to agree with Barbara and Mike. It was looking like Patricia didn't have the support she thought she did. Patricia was clearly frustrated. Fine. Then I propose we at least send Mr. Wells a formal letter demanding that he cease and desist his commercial activities and warning him that any violations of our covenants will result in fines. What violations? I asked. I've shown you that I'm operating legally within my rights. Operating a business in a residential zone is a violation, Patricia snapped. But my zone isn't purely residential. It has a commercial overlay which is specifically documented and legal. The meeting was getting heated, and I could see people in the audience getting uncomfortable. Henry stood up beside me. Look, I'm Henry Wagner, Harrison's business partner. I've been working with him on this Firewood business, and I can personally attest that he's been nothing but professional and respectful. He's a good neighbor who happens to run a small, quiet business from his property. The only disruption to this neighborhood has been Mrs. Morrison's harassment and her decision to call 911 over a legal firewood delivery. I did not harass anyone, Patricia said indignantly. I've been doing my job as HOA president. You've been targeting Harrison since the day he moved in, Henry countered. And now you're trying to use HOA resources to fund a personal vendetta. Patricia stood up abruptly. I don't have to sit here and be insulted. I call for a vote. All in favor of sending Mr. Wells a cease and desist letter and warning of potential fines, say aye. Aye, Patricia said, her voice alone in the room. There was an awkward silence. None of the other board members voted with her. Mike Chen spoke gently but firmly. Patricia, I don't think the board supports this action. Harrison has been cooperative and transparent. He's shown us all his legal documentation. I don't see a basis for threatening him with fines. I agree, Frank said. This feels like overreach. Barbara, Janet, and Tom all nodded their agreement. Patricia looked around the table, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Fine. But mark my words, this isn't over. If the board won't protect this community, I'll find other ways to address this problem. The threat hung in the air, and I felt a chill run down my spine. What exactly did she mean by other ways? The meeting continued with other business, but the tension remained. When things finally wrapped up, several neighbors came over to talk to me. Most were supportive, saying they had no problem with my business and thought Patricia was being ridiculous. A few expressed concern about property values, but seemed satisfied when I explained the legal situation. As Henry and I were leaving, Frank caught up with us in the parking lot. Harrison, I wanted to apologize on behalf of the board. Patricia doesn't speak for all of us. I appreciate that, Frank. Do you think this is really over? Frank grimaced. Honestly, probably not. Patricia doesn't like to lose and she's not going to drop this easily. You might want to be prepared for her to escalate things. How could she escalate more than calling 911 on me? I asked. I don't know, but if I were you, I'd watch my back. Maybe invest in some security cameras for your property, just in case. That advice stuck with me. Over the weekend, I installed a full security camera system around my house, covering the driveway, the backyard where I stored wood, and all the entrances. It felt paranoid, but Frank's warning had been sincere. For about a week, things were quiet. I received my regular deliveries, processed orders, and ran my business without incident. I started to think that maybe Patricia had finally backed down. I should have known better. The following Wednesday, I came home from making deliveries to find a notice taped to my front door. It was from the Asheville Code Enforcement Office, stating that a complaint had been filed regarding my property, and that an inspector would be coming to investigate alleged violations, including improper storage of materials, potential fire hazards, and operation of a business without proper permits. I called the number on the notice immediately and spoke with a code enforcement officer named Jennifer Martinez. Mr. Wells, we received a complaint about your property, she explained. We're required to investigate all complaints, so I'll need to schedule a time to come out and inspect. Can you tell me who filed the complaint? I asked, though I already knew. The complaint was anonymous, but it was quite detailed. The complainant alleges multiple code violations. I can assure you, everything is in order. I have all the proper permits and licenses. That's great, and if everything checks out, we'll close the complaint. But I still need to do the inspection. How's Friday morning? We scheduled the inspection for Friday at 10 in the morning. I immediately called Uncle Richard to let him know what was happening. This is Patricia trying to use the system to harass you, Uncle Richard said. But it might actually work in your favor. Once the code enforcement officer confirms you're in compliance with everything, you'll have official documentation that you can use to protect yourself. He was right. I spent Thursday making sure everything on my property was absolutely perfect. I organized my wood storage, double-checked my fire extinguishers, made sure all my equipment was properly maintained, and gathered all my permits and licenses into a neat folder. Friday morning, Jennifer Martinez arrived right on time. She was a professional woman in her 30s, carrying a clipboard and wearing a city ID badge. Mr. Wells, I'm Jennifer Martinez from Code Enforcement. Thanks for coming. I have all my documentation ready for you. I showed her around the property, explaining my business operations and showing her where everything was stored. She took photos, made notes, and reviewed all my paperwork carefully. The inspection took about an hour. "Mr. Wells, I'm not seeing any violations here," Jennifer said finally. "Your commercial permits are in order, your storage is appropriate and safe, and you're in compliance with all applicable codes. I'll be closing this complaint as unfounded." "Is there any way to find out who filed the complaint?" I asked. As I mentioned, it was anonymous. "But between you and me, I've been doing this job for 8 years, and I can usually tell when someone is filing a complaint as harassment versus genuine concern. This complaint read more like someone trying to cause trouble for you than someone actually worried about legitimate code violations." "That's exactly what it is," I said. "My HOA president has been targeting me because she doesn't like that I run a business from my home, even though I have full legal rights to do so." Jennifer frowned. "That's unfortunate. If you continue to receive harassing complaints, you might want to document everything and consider filing a police report. Filing false complaints can actually be considered a form of harassment." After she left, I felt relieved but also frustrated. How much of my time and energy was I going to have to spend defending myself against Patricia's attacks? The answer came sooner than I expected. On Saturday, I woke up to find that someone had scattered nails across my driveway during the night. Thankfully, I discovered them before driving over them, but it was clear that this was deliberate sabotage. I immediately thought of Frank's advice about security cameras. I checked the footage from the night before, and my blood ran cold when I saw what had been recorded. At around 2 in the morning, a figure in dark clothing and a hood had walked up my driveway and deliberately scattered something from a bag across the pavement. The person was trying to obscure their face, but in one frame as they turned to leave, the camera caught a clear view. It was Patricia Morrison. I stood in my living room, staring at the frozen image on my laptop screen. Patricia had actually committed a crime, had actually come onto my property in the middle of the night to sabotage me. This had gone way beyond HOA disputes and annoying complaints. I called the non-emergency police line and explained the situation. They sent an officer out within an hour. It was a different cop this time, a younger woman named Officer Sarah Brennan. "Mr. Wells, do you still have the nails that were scattered?" she asked. "Yes, I collected them carefully without touching them directly. I used a magnet and gloves." I showed her the bag of nails I'd gathered. "And you have video footage of who did this?" I showed her the security camera footage. Officer Brennan watched it several times, particularly the frame where Patricia's face was visible. "You know this person?" she asked. "Yes, that's Patricia Morrison. She's the president of my HOA and she's been harassing me for months about my business." I explained the whole situation, from the 911 call to the code enforcement complaint to the ongoing disputes at HOA meetings. Officer Brennan took detailed notes. "Mr. Wells, this is clearly criminal trespass and potentially vandalism or malicious damage. I'm going to take this footage and the physical evidence. We'll investigate and likely press charges. Do you want to pursue this?" "Absolutely," I said. "I've tried to be reasonable and patient, but this crosses a line. She came onto my property in the middle of the night to try to damage my vehicle or hurt me financially. That's not just annoying, that's dangerous." Officer Brennan nodded. "I agree. We take this kind of thing seriously. I'll need you to come down to the station to make a formal statement, and we'll proceed from there." I went to the police station that afternoon and spent 2 hours giving a detailed statement. I brought copies of all the documentation showing Patricia's pattern of harassment. The 911 call, the code enforcement complaint, the HOA meeting minutes, everything. The detective who interviewed me, Detective Raymond Hughes, seemed very interested in the case. Mr. Wells, based on what you're telling me and what we're seeing in this footage, it looks like Mrs. Morrison has been engaged in a sustained campaign of harassment against you. The trespassing and scattering of nails is the most serious offense, but the pattern of behavior is concerning. What happens now? I asked. We'll interview Mrs. Morrison and give her a chance to explain herself. The video evidence is pretty damning, but we'll follow proper procedure. Depending on how that goes, we'll likely file charges. You should also consider getting a restraining order. Over the next few days, I felt like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Henry came over Sunday evening to check on me. "Dude, this is insane," he said. "Patricia actually came to your house in the middle of the night to scatter nails. What did she think was going to happen?" "I don't think she was thinking clearly," I said. "I think she's so obsessed with getting rid of me that she's lost perspective. Well, she's about to learn a hard lesson about consequences." On Monday afternoon, I got a call from Detective Hughes. "Mr. Wells, I wanted to update you. We interviewed Patricia Morrison this morning. She initially denied being at your property, but when we showed her the video footage, she broke down and admitted it. She claimed she was trying to send you a message about not belonging in the neighborhood. So what happens to her?" "We're charging her with criminal trespass and vandalism. She'll need to appear in court. You should also know that she resigned as HOA president this afternoon." That news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By Tuesday, everyone knew that Patricia had been arrested and charged with crimes related to her harassment of me. The reaction from neighbors was mixed. Some people seemed shocked and sympathetic to Patricia, while others said they'd always thought she was too aggressive and controlling. Frank called me Tuesday evening. "Harrison, the HOA board is having an emergency meeting tomorrow night. We need to elect a new president and address what happened. I wanted you to know that the board is planning to issue a formal apology to you for the harassment you've endured." I attended that meeting, and it was surreal compared to the last one. The room was packed again, but the atmosphere was completely different. Frank, as vice president, ran the meeting in Patricia's absence. "First, I want to address the situation with our former president," Frank began. "As many of you have heard, Patricia Morrison was arrested and charged with criminal trespass and vandalism related to an incident at Harrison Wells's property. The board was not aware of her actions, and we absolutely don't condone that kind of behavior." He turned to look at me. "Harrison, on behalf of the entire board and the Maple Ridge Estates HOA, I want to apologize for the harassment and difficulty you've experienced. You've been a good neighbor, and you've operated your business legally and professionally. We hope you'll continue to be part of this community." There was scattered applause from the audience. I stood up and nodded. "I appreciate that, Frank, and I want to be clear that I don't hold anyone else responsible for Patricia's actions. I'm happy to be part of this community." The meeting continued with the election of a new president. Mike Chen was elected, with Frank remaining as vice president. One of the first actions the new board took was to pass a resolution officially recognizing the commercial rights of properties like mine, and stating that the HOA would not interfere with legal business operations. Over the next few weeks, things gradually returned to normal. My business continued to thrive, and I had more firewood orders than I could handle as fall settled into winter and people prepared for the cold months ahead. The legal case against Patricia moved forward. She pleaded guilty to the charges rather than going to trial. At her sentencing hearing in November, I was asked to give a victim impact statement. I stood in the courtroom, looking at Patricia sitting at the defendant's table. She looked smaller somehow, less intimidating than she had when she was banging that gavel at HOA meetings. Your Honor, what Patricia Morrison did to me was more than just a property crime, I said. It was part of a months-long campaign to drive me out of my home and destroy my business. She called 911 on me, filed false code enforcement complaints, tried to use HOA resources to fund legal action against me, and finally resorted to criminal behavior when none of that worked. I bought my home because it was perfect for my needs, and I've tried to be a good neighbor. What Patricia did made me feel unsafe in my own home. However, I hope that she gets the help she needs to understand why her behavior was wrong and to address whatever issues led her to act this way. The judge sentenced Patricia to 1 year of probation, community service, a fine, and mandatory anger management counseling. He also issued a restraining order prohibiting her from coming within 100 yards of me or my property. Leaving the courtroom, I felt a sense of closure. It wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about establishing boundaries and making sure Patricia understood that her actions had real consequences. As December arrived and Asheville got its first real snow, my firewood business was booming. People all over the area wanted quality wood for their fireplaces and wood stoves, and Henry and I could barely keep up with demand. One Saturday morning, I was loading up my truck for deliveries when I saw a car pull up. It was Barbara Allen from the HOA board. "Harrison, I hope I'm not bothering you," she said, getting out of her car. "I wanted to order some firewood if you're taking new customers. Mike Chen bought some from you last week and said it's the best wood he's ever had." I smiled. "Of course. How much do you need?" "A full cord if you can manage it. I can deliver it this afternoon." As I wrote up her order, Barbara looked around at my setup. "You know, Harrison, I'm glad you stood your ground against Patricia. This neighborhood is better off having someone like you here, someone who works hard and contributes to the community. What Patricia did was wrong, and I'm sorry we didn't step in sooner." "You stepped in when it mattered," I said. "I appreciate the support from you and the rest of the board." That afternoon, I delivered wood to Barbara and several other customers around Asheville. As I drove through the mountain roads, listening to classic rock and watching the snow-dusted peaks, I felt grateful for how things had turned out. I'd bought my house on Maple Ridge Drive because it had the commercial rights I needed, and because the community seemed nice. I'd never expected to deal with someone like Patricia Morrison, to have the police called on me multiple times, to install security cameras to protect against sabotage, or to testify at a criminal sentencing hearing. But I'd also discovered that most people are reasonable and decent. My neighbors, once they understood the situation, were supportive. The police and legal system, while bureaucratic, ultimately worked the way they were supposed to. And the HOA board, despite one bad actor, proved willing to do the right thing. Henry called me as I was heading home from my last delivery. "Hey, how'd today go?" "Good, really good. We've got orders lined up through the end of January already." "That's awesome, man, and you know what? I've been thinking maybe we should expand a little bit. There's enough demand that we could hire someone part-time to help with processing and deliveries." "Yeah, I've been thinking the same thing. Let's talk about it this week." When I got home that evening, my driveway was clear, my property was peaceful, and the only lights I saw were the warm glow of Christmas decorations starting to appear around the neighborhood. I unloaded my truck, stacked some extra wood for my own fireplace, and went inside to warm up. Later, sitting by my fire with a good book and a cup of hot chocolate, I reflected on the whole saga with Patricia and the HOA. It had been stressful and frustrating, but it had also taught me important lessons about standing up for yourself, documenting everything, and not backing down when you know you're right. The firewood crackled and popped in the fireplace, oak and hickory mixing together to produce perfect heat. Outside, snow began to fall again, dusting Maple Ridge Drive in white. My phone buzzed with a notification, another firewood order coming through my website. I smiled and added it to my schedule for Monday. Business was good, my legal troubles were over, and life in my little corner of Asheville was exactly what I'd hoped it would be when I first moved here. The HOA had a new president who was reasonable and fair. Patricia Morrison was dealing with the consequences of her actions and hopefully learning from them. And I was running my legal, legitimate business from my property without interference or harassment. Sometimes standing your ground means going through hell first. But on the other side of that hell, when the dust settles and the truth comes out, there's satisfaction in knowing you did things the right way and didn't let bullies win. As winter deepened and my firewood business thrived, I became more involved in the neighborhood community. I attended HOA meetings regularly, not because I had to defend myself anymore, but because I wanted to be an active participant. Mike Chen turned out to be an excellent HOA president, focused on practical issues like road maintenance and community events, rather than on petty complaints and power trips. In January, the HOA organized a neighborhood winter party at the clubhouse. I donated firewood for the outdoor fire pits, and several neighbors thanked me personally for handling the situation with Patricia with grace and dignity. A few people apologized for not speaking up sooner when they saw her targeting me. "We just didn't want to get involved," one neighbor admitted. HOA drama seemed like something to avoid, but watching what you went through made me realize that silence can enable bad behavior. That conversation stuck with me. So many problems persist because good people stay silent, not wanting to make waves or get involved in conflict. I'd been forced into conflict by Patricia's actions, but I'd learned that sometimes standing up and speaking out is the only way to stop injustice. By spring, my business had grown significantly. Henry and I hired a part-time employee, a young guy named Marcus who was studying forestry at the university and needed work that related to his field. The three of us made a good team, and we expanded our service area to cover more of the greater Asheville region. I saw Patricia from a distance a few times over the months following her sentencing. She'd moved to a different part of the neighborhood, apparently finding her old house too uncomfortable after everything that happened. When we passed on the street, she'd look away quickly, and I'd nod politely and continue on my way. I didn't harbor hatred toward her, just a hope that she'd learned from the experience. In May, I attended a regional small business association meeting where I met other home-based business owners who'd faced similar challenges with HOAs. It turned out my situation wasn't unique. HOAs across the country often overstepped their authority, and many homeowners didn't know their rights or didn't have the resources to fight back. One woman told me about how her HOA tried to shut down her online consulting business, claiming that receiving mail related to her work violated covenants. Another man described being fined repeatedly for parking his work van in his own driveway, even though he was a licensed contractor, and the van was perfectly legal. Hearing these stories made me realize how fortunate I'd been to have clear documentation of my commercial rights and the resources to defend myself. Many people weren't so lucky. That realization inspired me to put together a resource guide for home-based business owners dealing with HOA disputes. I worked with Uncle Richard to create a simple, clear document explaining property rights, HOA limitations, and steps to take when facing harassment or overreach. We posted it online for free, and it ended up being shared widely in HOA forums and small business communities. By the time summer rolled around, the whole saga with Patricia felt like ancient history. My business was thriving. I had good relationships with my neighbors, and life on Maple Ridge Drive was peaceful and pleasant. One warm July evening, I was sitting on my front porch after a long day of deliveries when Frank walked over with a cold beer in hand. "Thought you might need this," he said, handing me the beer and sitting down in the other porch chair. "Thanks, man. What's up?" "Nothing really. Just wanted to say that I'm glad you decided to stay after everything that happened. A lot of people would have cut their losses and moved." I took a sip of the beer and considered that. "I thought about it," I admitted. Right after the nail incident, I seriously considered selling and finding somewhere else. But this is my home, you know. I worked hard to get here, and I wasn't going to let someone else's bad behavior drive me away from a place I loved. Frank nodded. "That took guts. And I think the neighborhood is better for it. You showed people that you can stand up to bullies without becoming one yourself. That matters." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The air was warm and sweet with the smell of summer flowers. Kids rode bikes down the street. Someone was grilling dinner a few houses down. It was exactly the kind of peaceful neighborhood evening that Patricia had claimed to be protecting when she was harassing me. The irony wasn't lost on me. "Hey, Frank," I said after a while. "Can I ask you something? Did you ever figure out why Patricia had it out for me so badly? I mean, other than the business, was there something else?" Frank was quiet for a moment. "I've thought about that a lot," he finally said. "I think the truth is that Patricia defined herself by being HOA president. It gave her purpose and power. When you moved in with your commercial rights, it represented something she couldn't control. And for someone whose whole identity was wrapped up in controlling the neighborhood, that was intolerable. So it was never really about covenants or property values." "Not really, no. It was about her need to feel important and in charge. Your independence threatened that. When you didn't back down, she escalated because backing down herself would mean admitting she didn't have absolute authority. It made sense in a sad way. Patricia had turned the HOA presidency into her whole life, and when someone challenged that, she'd spiraled out of control rather than accept reasonable boundaries. "I hope she's doing better now," I said, and I meant it. "I hope the counseling helped her find some perspective." "Me too," Frank agreed. "For her sake and for her family's sake." As fall approached again and the business cycle ramped back up, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed in just over a year. I'd gone from being a newcomer to the neighborhood, harassed and targeted, to being an established member of the community with friends and supporters. The HOA, under Mike Chen's leadership, had become a functional organization focused on actual community needs, rather than on policing every little thing residents did. The new board had approved several common-sense updates to the covenants, including clarifying that pre-existing commercial rights would be respected, and that enforcement actions would require evidence of actual harm or nuisance, rather than just technical violations. In September, exactly 1 year after Patricia had first called 911 on my firewood delivery, Tony from Mountain Wood Supply pulled up with another load. "Hey, Harrison," he called out as he climbed out of his truck. "You ready for another busy season?" "Born ready," I said with a grin. "Let's get this wood unloaded." As we worked, a couple of neighbors walking by stopped to chat. One asked about ordering firewood for the winter. Another joked about how much quieter the neighborhood had been since Patricia stepped down. When the delivery was finished and Tony drove away, I stood in my driveway looking at the neatly stacked cords of wood. This time last year, That same scene had resulted in police cars and harassment. Now it was just a normal day, a routine business operation, exactly as it should have been from the beginning. My phone rang. It was a new customer wanting to schedule a delivery for October. I took down the information, confirmed the order, and added it to my growing list. Business was good. Life was good. That evening, I built a fire in my fireplace, even though it wasn't quite cold enough to need it. There was something symbolic about burning firewood from the business that had caused so much drama and trouble. The very thing Patricia had tried so hard to stop was now thriving, warming homes across Asheville and providing me with a good living. As I watched the flames dance, I thought about all the lessons I'd learned over the past year. Stand up for yourself, but do it legally and ethically. Document everything. Don't back down from bullies, but don't become one yourself. Most people are reasonable if you give them a chance. The legal system, while slow, generally works if you have patience and evidence. And sometimes the worst conflicts can lead to the best outcomes if you handle them right. I also learned that community matters. The support I'd received from neighbors like Frank, from board members like Mike Chen and Barbara Allen, and from my business partner Henry had made all the difference. I hadn't fought this battle alone, even when it felt like it. The fire crackled and popped, and I added another log. Outside, the first hints of fall were touching the leaves, turning them gold and red. Soon the mountains around Asheville would be ablaze with autumn colors, and my busiest season would be in full swing. I picked up my phone and sent a text to Henry. Another year, another firewood season. Thanks for having my back through all the craziness. His response came quickly. Always, brother. That's what partners are for. Let's make this the best year yet. I smiled and set the phone down. Tomorrow I'd be back to work, processing orders, making deliveries, and running the business I'd worked so hard to build and defend. But tonight, I was just going to sit by the fire in my home on Maple Ridge Drive and appreciate how far I'd come. The journey from that first 911 call to this peaceful evening had been difficult and stressful, but it had also been worth it. I'd proven to myself and to everyone else that I belonged here, that I had the right to run my business, and that standing up for yourself matters. As the fire burned down to embers, and the night grew darker outside my windows, I felt a deep sense of contentment. This was my home, my business, my community, and my life. Nobody was going to take that away from me by calling 911, filing false complaints, or scattering nails in my driveway. I'd faced down an HOA Karen at her worst, been vindicated by the law, and come out the other side stronger and more confident. The dispatcher who checked my commercial rights that day when Patricia called had been right, and everyone else had eventually seen the truth too. In the end, truth and documentation had won out over harassment and abuse of power. The system had worked, justice had prevailed, and life in Maple Ridge Estates was better for everyone because one person had refused to be bullied out of his home and his livelihood. As I headed to bed that night, I took one last look at my security camera feeds, a habit I'd maintained even after Patricia's conviction. Everything was quiet and peaceful. My property was secure, my business was legitimate, and my place in this community was solid. Tomorrow would bring new orders, new deliveries, and new opportunities. But tonight, I slept well, knowing that I'd fought the good fight and won. Not through aggression or revenge, but through patience, documentation, and unwavering belief in my right to live and work peacefully on my own property. And really, what more could anyone ask for than that?